Chapter 27, Act 27, Golbez's Tale. Act 27, Golbez's Tale, The Road to Hell.
Hum hum hum.
Here is your food. Golbez tried not to stare as a white lagomorph shuffled up to him with a pink hood, wide blue eyes, and a steaming lump wrapped in what looked like paper that was made out of metal.
Thank you,
Fusoya said, being handed a lump of his own. Golbez watched him peel back the metal wrapping, revealing a glistening sweet potato, and taking a huge bite.
Delicious as always, Humingway. Hum hum hum.
The rabbit in front of Golbez shoved his offering up higher, but since he was so tiny compared to Golbez's massive frame, he only succeeded in reaching his knees. Golbez stooped down, accepting the potato and giving the rabbit an awkward pat on his head.
Thanks.
Golbez unwrapped his food, giving it one last stare before lifting it to his mouth. A familiar burst of starchy sweetness hit his tongue, and he relaxed his clenching shoulders.
This isn't so bad. It just begs the question. How does one grow sweet potatoes on the moon? Another tale for another time,
Fusoya smiled.
But the Humingway race itself is an enigma that I have not been able to solve in all my time on this moon, so I've learned not to question them too much and to just accept the absurdity of their existence. I am quite happy to have some semblance of enchantment in my life, especially after some of the things I've seen.
He nodded toward the entrance of the cave he had led them into.
Shall we continue to the crater?
Certainly, Golbez replied, grateful that he would no longer be stared at by dozens of twinkling, vacant eyes. The entire Humingway clan was watching him expectantly, their massive front teeth flashing in matching grins.
Although we really didn't have to stop on my account. The sounds your stomach was making would have awoken every sleeping beast in our path. Besides, it's been 17 years since you've last eaten, and we'll both need our strength for whatever is to come. This all sounds very promising.
The walk to the crater was a short distance away from the Humingway abode. The two men could smell it before it even came into sight. The normally sterile atmosphere of the moon was tainted with a curdling stench that made Golbez's eyes and nostrils burn. He had to force himself to eat the rest of his food, since the first whiff of the sight had instantly eradicated his appetite. The silky dust that normally covered the moon's surface had been depressed into a deep pit and blackened beyond recognition. Jagged glowing red cracks traced the core, splintering out toward the crater's rim. Lavender gases occasionally spurted into the air from lacerations in the ground, forming a dense blanket of smog. Golbez knelt down, digging his fingers into the scorched ground and unearthing a couple of broken rocks and dirt-encrusted ice shards.
Look at this.
He brought the rocks to his nose, inhaling.
It smells like a blade left too long in the forge. There must have been a meteor strike here.
Fusoya stroked his beard, the small smile granted by his visit to the Humingway adobe now vanished.
But this crater looks so different than any other impact site I've seen. The Red Moon has been hit by much debris over the years, but nothing like this. What remains is eating away at the land itself, like a parasite.
Golbez frowned.
If it keeps up, we're going to have a massive sinkhole on our hands.
Fusoya sighed.
This may be no mere meteor after all. What exactly do you mean by that? I can't say anything else beyond that for now. Even I am at a loss.
Fusoya narrowed his eyes as he peered deeper into the impact site, and Golbez rose to his feet, letting the tainted moon dust fall from his fingers. He followed Fusoya's gaze, his stomach somersaulting as he saw a faint shadow flicker in the hazy depths.
Is someone in there? Someone or something?
Golbez found himself subconsciously feeling for his blade to ensure it was still where he left it hanging from his shoulder.
When you woke up, was anyone else missing? No. I checked all the pods before I left to be sure.
Fusoya closed his eyes, pressing his gnarled fingers over his chest.
Whoever is down there, they are not a Lunarian. That much I can tell.
Fusoya and Golbez looked at each other, and without another word, crossed the rim of the impact site. Sliding down the rock-strewn slopes, or in Fusoya's case, gliding, they both kept their eyes trained on the shadow, which didn't seem to be making much of an effort to go anywhere. It would start to walk in one direction, pause, and then swivel around to go another direction, never leaving the 10-foot radius it had carved out for itself. Finally it stopped, the sound of harried wheezing carrying through the crater. Pushing past a final curtain of smog, Golbez and Fusoya came to a halt, eyes wide. The creature in front of them was no more than a girl, a fairly young one, at that. Her back was turned to them, covered in a sweep of turquoise hair that fell in soft waves down her spine, a white gown brushing the tops of her feet. Her hands were clenched into fists at her sides, skin so pale that it was nearly translucent. Her head was bowed, and her shoulders gently rose and with each heavy gasp of breath.
"And who might you be?"
Fusoya asked gently.
"Are you okay?"
Golbez extended his hand toward her. As if sensing he was getting too close, the girl whirled around, taking a few steps back and baring her teeth.
"Where are the crystals?"
she demanded. Her troubled breathing suddenly ceased, her amber eyes were narrowed, and her silver and ruby jewelry jingled with her abrupt movements. Fusoya cut a glance at Golbez before answering, and Golbez noticed that his grip had tightened considerably on his staff. He decided to let his uncle do the talking for now, and to keep his eyes on the little stranger. She was glaring daggers at Fusoya, and her upper lip was twitching with impatience. Fusoya arched his brow.
"Why do you want to know?" "There should be 8 more crystals on this moon,"
she barked, as if she were talking to an imbecile. Fusoya tilted his head.
8 more? What are you talking about?"
The girl crossed her arms over her chest, one slender finger extended across her arm as she slowly shook her head. The slight movement had lifted her gown, and Golbez saw that her bare toes were buried in moon dust. Fusoya shrugged.
"No reply? Then don't expect one from us, either."
The 3 of them fell into a staring match, with the mysterious girl glowering at Fusoya, Fusoya returning the favor, and Golbez's attention bouncing between the 2 of them, his hand once again hovering over his sword. After a few strained moments, the mysterious girl finally shook her head, rolling her eyes.
"It makes no difference."
Golbez took a step forward, and the click of his blade's hilt hitting the prayer beads wrapped around his wrist pierced the otherwise still air.
"What?"
The girl smirked, raising one hand in the air.
"I will have all the time I need to search for them. Once I obliterate the both of you."
A pale yellow light embraced her form, and an assembly of yellow and jade crystal spheres appeared in the air, whirling around the girl in a blinding frenzy until they exploded into shimmering particles of light. Golbez and Fusoya drew back, covering their eyes as the light swallowed the 3 of them whole and made the ground beneath their feet quake, a shriek ripping through the air. When the light had finally faded, the Lunarians dared to open their eyes, sensing that they had been joined by yet another presence. Standing before them now was the mysterious girl encased in white light, her eyes narrowed and her hair wildly whipping behind her, and in front of her was her newly summoned champion, a leggy goddess with flaxen hair piled atop her head in a severe bun. Spiked, red hair combs that were carved from the bones of enemies long gone from this world were tucked in her tresses strategically to keep everything held in place. Her canary yellow wrap gown hung past her hips, and grasped in her henna-tattooed hands were a pair of scimitars, each gleaming with the threat of having been freshly polished and sharpened for use on a new opponent to add to her ornament collection. Her violet eyes were dead hollows that held no light, and her flesh had a sickly green tint, the skin pulled so tightly over her cheekbones that she resembled a skull with hair. Golbez felt a stinging behind his eyes. Wincing, he withdrew his ebony sword, trying to ignore his memory's desperate efforts to recall where he had seen this woman before. It didn't seem too terribly important since she looked ready to shove both of her blades down his and Fusoya's respective throats. But Fusoya had no such difficulties with his memory. He lowered his staff in surprise, taking a step closer.
"Ashura,"
he gasped, and the scattered puzzle pieces fell into place in Golbez's brain. Click. She is Ashura, Queen of the Feymarch, the land of summoned monsters.
Why are you summoning the Eidolons?"
Golbez cried.
"What happened to Rydia of Mist?" "Rydia of Mist?"
The mysterious girl trailed off, her eyes narrowed with malice.
"He mistook me for her too. You humans really are foolish." "Ah-ha!"
Ashura screamed, 2 more pairs of arms exploding from her sides accompanied with the nauseating sound of tearing flesh. One of the new pairs was outfitted in yet more blades, a slender épée and a ribbon-wrapped spear, and the other pair held a single diamond-crested staff. Her head twisted on her neck in a bizarre angle, revealing a new face that looked as if it had been charbroiled and left in the sun to dry into leather, white war paint smeared beneath her eyes. She leapt forward, her épée connecting with Golbez's ebony blade as he threw himself between Ashura and Fusoya. With a grunt, he drove her off, thrusting forward in a parry and delivering a nasty fissure to her forearm.
"What do we do?"
Golbez asked while Ashura howled in recoil. Her faces spun once again, this time revealing her previous human face and casting a Curaga spell on herself.
"Ashura is not going to let us touch that girl, she's completely under her control." Indeed, this is not the same Azura that befriended Rydia of Mist.
Fusoya shook his head.
It seems that she does not recognize me at all. I'm afraid we have no choice but to take them both out at once. Shall I focus on defense while you take over on offense? Works for me.
Golbez shrugged, and gestured for Fusoya to get out of his way. Fusoya scrambled a few yards behind Golbez and began to rattle off a succession of defensive spells to give them a semblance of protection. Azura finished healing herself, her eyes locking on Fusoya as he became immersed in another spell.
Hey, over here.
Golbez snapped, raising his hand and motioning for Azura to pay attention to him. In lieu of moving, her head spun around once more to face him, this time revealing a stone-masked demon that had black, gaping eye holes and a slash for a mouth. Golbez stepped forward with his blade raised, but as Azura spun to parry with her spear, he quickly fired off a quake spell instead, the ground beneath Azura and the mysterious girl splitting open and swallowing them into shallow chasms. The girl screamed at Azura to help her as she tried to claw her way out of the volatile plates. Just as her hands brushed the surface, the land hiccuped again and dragged her back into the churning pit.
Aieee!
Azura shrieked, 3 of her 6 arms flailing as her head spun once again to her healing face. Just as she was about to cast Curaga on herself and the girl, Fusoya hit the 2 of them with Reflect, and her healing magic bounced off them and collided with Golbez, filling him with a rush of divine energy.
I'm sorry, Azura.
Golbez whispered under his breath.
I swore I would never raise my hands against the Eidolons again, but...
He closed his eyes, a storm of crackling energy racing up his spine and igniting every nerve ending in his body. Fusoya must have followed up with a haste spell. He took advantage of the buff, calling down 2 simultaneous flare spells that rained hellfire upon both Azura and the mysterious girl, trapping them in a cage of flame that accumulated into an explosion so fierce that it blew away the curtains of smog. His cloak whipped back so violently from the impact that he was nearly strangled. When the shower of moon dust that had been tossed in the air finally settled, they were left with Azura wilted in her chasm, her head lolled on the ground and her eyes screwed shut. She faded away with nary a whimper, her bent and melted weapons disappearing alongside her. Golbez heard Fusoya approach from behind as he walked over to where he had trapped the mysterious girl, kneeling down to get a closer look. She was collapsed at the bottom of the pit, her head twisted at an odd angle and her charred face streaked with blood. Golbez bent over the ledge, grabbing her arm and dragging her back to the surface. He could feel before completing this task that she was far gone, her flesh was stiff and cold through the threading of her gossamer gown, and her head flopped about as if it were hanging by a string, her neck was broken through and through.
We have slain her,
Fusoya muttered. Golbez gently pressed his fingers over her eyelids, sliding them down so that her vacant yellow glare no longer bore into him.
Yes. She was stronger than her appearance would lead one to believe. Why would a girl like that be wielding Eidolons? I don't know, but I suspect it bodes ill for us.
Golbez stood back up, crossing his arms.
Yes.
Fusoya turned to Golbez, resting his hand over his arm.
You had no choice, Golbez. I hope that I didn't put you in a regrettable situation.
Golbez bit his lip, turning away. He could feel something putrid churning in his stomach, but willed it to stay deep, deep inside, where it could fester quietly. He would deal with it later, maybe in his nightmares, once he was back asleep.
No. My decisions were my own. Besides, I can't yield white magic like you and Cecil, I couldn't even cast Cure as a kid. If you hadn't been left to our defense, things would have turned out a lot worse for us.
Fusoya nodded, lowering his hand.
Bahamut, the All-Father of Eidolons, resides in a cave north of here. I think it'd be best if we checked up on him, maybe he can help us understand what happened to Azura. Right,
Golbez replied, taking one last look at the mysterious girl's corpse. She had not yet faded away or crumbled to dust, that confirmed she had not been a monster in a human guise. Remembering the girl's final words before their battle had begun, he turned back to Fusoya.
The girl said something about another human mistaking her for Rydia. What do you suppose she meant by that? She could have been bluffing to throw us off,
Fusoya sighed.
But it may be more likely that she has already encountered someone else who knew Rydia. Someone who knew her well enough to understand that she should have been the one to hold sway over the Eidolons.
Golbez closed his eyes, the raucous hammering in his chest had begun again, same as when Cecil's blade had sliced through him in his nightmare. I can count the number of people who would know Rydia that intimately on one hand. Bahamut's cavern on the Red Moon was known among the Lunarians as the Lair of the Father. Fusoya remembered the first time he had encountered Bahamut as clearly as if it had happened yesterday, and felt compelled to share the story with Golbez as they hiked out of the rotting impact site and made their way northbound. Part of him had wanted to distract Golbez from the unexpected encounter in the crater. No matter how desperately Golbez tried to hide his heart, Fusoya could sense the deep pain that had been reawakened in him when he had been forced to defeat Ashura and the mysterious girl, even if they had been a threat to the crystals. But another part of him also relished in the normalcy in something as trite as telling his nephew a story from his younger days. He supposed this was something real families did. After all, his own father had shared many tales of his own life with him and Kluya before everything went to hell. He idly wondered what stories Kluya had shared with Golbez, if any, in their short time together before Kluya died. He recalled how Golbez had barely reacted to the news of his Lunarian heritage 17 years prior when Fusoya had explained to him who Zemus was and how it was their Lunarian blood that had made Zemus target Golbez for his scheme. His response had been the complete opposite of Cecil's, whom Fusoya was also fated to break the news of his true heritage to. His youngest nephew had been gutted by the news that he was only half human, not able to speak for quite some time after. When he later learned Golbez was his brother, he shut down even more. His friends had barely been able to convince him to escape the collapsing giant of Babel. Those two are all that remain of my family, now? And even so, they traverse separate roads. Are Kluya and I's sad fates destined to be repeated once again? Fusoya quietly shook his head to himself, deciding that he now needed the distraction too, and began his tale.
It could not have been more than a few weeks after we had created this moon that I first had the dream. Your father had already made his first unaccompanied visit to the blue planet. He was due to come back home that morning. In my dream, Bahamut had approached me in human form, advising me that he had taken a cavern to the north as his refuge, and that I was to tell my people he was never to be disturbed, lest they meet a horrific fate.
Golbez raised an eyebrow.
This is not the kind of story you should be telling while we are walking to Bahamut's domain. What kind of horrific fate are we talking about here?
Fusoya chuckled, shaking his head.
Heavens, I'm not really sure. I didn't think about it too much. A vast majority of the refugee Lunarians were afraid to step foot outside of the Crystal Palace and were perfectly content in the village they had erected in the lunar subterrane. It seemed to me if this mysterious individual wanted one cavern to himself, then that was a perfectly reasonable request. Anyway, your father came home, and I foolishly shared my dream with him. Being the font of curiosity that he was, Kluya of course wanted to immediately check out the cave for himself. I knew he was going to sneak off regardless of my protests, so I decided I may as well go with him. That does sound like my father.
Golbez smiled slightly.
It's fuzzy, but I can remember him getting yelled at a lot by my mother for the dangerous plots he oftentimes walked right into. At the time, I didn't think much of it. It just became background noise, and he always came home. But knowing some of the things I know now, I bet there was never a time she was not worried about him walking back through the door.
Fusoya smiled back.
I guess nothing changed when he went to live on the blue planet, then. I oftentimes felt the same way when we lived together. When I followed him to the lair of the father, I asked him what his plan was, and he just shrugged and said he wanted to ask Bahamut what it was about our little moon that made it so appealing a hiding place. That was it. I was so flummoxed that I couldn't bring myself to say any more until we had finally come face to face with Bahamut himself. By then, I was a quivering mess of robes, and Kluya just marched up to his dais, introduced himself, and asked the question. What happened? I honestly think that Bahamut went into shock. He remained in his human form, thank the gods for that, and didn't say anything for a long while. Finally, he looked at Kluya, and then myself, and said, my children were driving me insane, and I couldn't take another minute of even being on the same planet as they. I just wanted some peace and quiet. Ever since they married, it's been non-stop vulgarity. What?
Golbez blanched.
Surely, you jest. I'm afraid not,
Fusoya laughed.
He explained to us that he was the Eidolon Allfather who had previously lived in the Feymarch on the blue planet, and told us all about summoners and their relationship with Eidolons. He had never forged a covenant with a summoner himself, he had never found one worthy enough, in his eyes. After his children married, he decided enough was enough and took off. Unlike Kluya, he had no hope that any humans would ever evolve enough to be deserving of his power. The only thing Bahamut values more than a valiant heart is stillness. He's an ancient and powerful creature, and is only able to read the hearts of his adversaries in total silence. As a human, he's blind, a form he chose on purpose as to not cloud his own judgment. And let me guess, his children were Ashura and Leviathan, yes. The queen and king of the Eidolons, siblings before their union. I see.
Golbez looked down, trying to contain a shudder.
I guess they do things a bit differently in the Feymarch. Indeed. But Bahamut was a good ally to me while I was watching over the Lunarian slumber, and he's been an even better ally to Rydia and your brother. That's why I...
Fusoya looked down, and Golbez paused. He hadn't realized it because they had been talking so much, but they were approaching the entrance of a new cavern. He presumed they had reached their destination. Golbez turned to Fusoya, clearing his throat.
You don't owe me any explanations, Fusoya. I already told you I would help. Yes, but... I had only asked about investigating the meteor. This is different. The girl is gone now, whoever she was. It makes no difference to me.
Golbez frowned.
Listen, I'm not going back into stasis until this is all figured out, so just let me help, okay? It's the very, very least I could do at this point. Please let me have this. Bahamut should be able to face the man who slew his daughter.
Fusoya turned his gaze upon Golbez, who was staring down at him silently, his hands at his waist and his fingers drumming impatiently over his abdomen. Golbez. You do realize that not even Zemus was powerful enough to destroy your inner light, right? You are Cluya's son. And I see all of his goodness within you, even after everything that has happened. Do you understand that your pursuit to right all of Zemu's wrongs will only end in devastation?
What?
Golbez pressed, and Fusoya blinked. He hadn't realized that he had not been speaking aloud.
Nothing. Thank you, Golbez. Let us hurry.
They entered the cave, which was remarkably structured like the lunar subterrane. If Golbez hadn't known any better, he would have thought they had been buried below the Crystal Palace once again, although this cavern was draped in many more shadows that made seeing where you were going a near impossibility, even with the mouth of the cavern mere feet behind them. But the most striking difference between the two places was the eerie silence that permeated the air. Not even their footsteps gave way to an echo as they crossed the dust-ridden cavern floors. Golbez cast fire, a globe of flame bursting to life in his outstretched palm to guide them. But Fusoya could have traversed the cave blindfolded. Although he had only ever physically visited the cavern once with Cluya, he had come back many times in his dreams to converse with Bahamut while his people slept in the depths of space-time. Out of morbid curiosity to see if his voice would even carry in such a place, Golbez posed a question as they slid down a small slope to another winding tunnel.
It's just Bahamut here.
He could hear himself speak, which somehow made him feel a little less nervous, but Fusoya didn't acknowledge the question for a few moments. Just when he was starting to grow concerned that perhaps he was only hearing the voice in his own head, Fusoya shook his head.
Not exactly. You'll see in the next cavern. We're almost there now.
15 minutes later, they crossed into a new chamber, which took them from the constrained and claustrophobic tunnel paths into an open-air grotto that was overwhelming in its opulence. A massive dais was carved at the ledge of a cliff, the natural floor of the cavern polished and smoothed into an exquisite tableau that had the look of snowy granite. A semicircle of columns had been erected around the dais, the shadows of each intersecting in the center of the dais to create a starburst pattern, despite there being no visible light source in the cavern that would have produced such an effect. The tops of the columns were swallowed by the darkness above. There was no telling with the naked eye where the chamber ceiling actually resided. The path to the dais was punctuated with a small flight of stairs, and flanking each side were two petite figures. Upon closer inspection, Golbez realized they were children, one boy with light blue hair, and a girl with light pink hair pulled back into pigtails that dragged on the floor. The children were staring at the two of them with abject horror on their faces, their wide, pupilless eyes unblinking even as Golbez and Fusoya came closer.
What's wrong?
Golbez asked while Fusoya swept by him and began to climb the dais steps.
Bahamut. It's terrible.
The boy drawled in a monotone. He sounded as if he had been drugged.
You can fix him for us. Right.
The girl murmured, her eyes still staring straight ahead. Golbez kneeled before her, taking her shoulders and shaking her gently to try to get her to look at him. Her head lolled as her body rocked back and forth, her mouth frozen in mid-sentence.
Bahamut.
Fusoya cried from above, and Golbez released the girl, clenching his jaw as he raced up the dais steps two at a time. He found Fusoya standing in the center of the starburst, where the shadows from the columns were the densest. In front of him, a statue of an elegant man was raised, dressed in vestal robes with a collar that rose over his lips and ended just below the tip of his aquiline nose. His eyes were obscured by a plaited circlet, secured around shoulder-length hair that would have been impossibly straight in real life.
Where is he?
Golbez asked, and Fusoya nodded toward the statue. Golbez's eyebrows rose in confusion.
He's been petrified? Can't you cast a Suna? No,
Fusoya sighed.
It's much worse than that. It appears that he's been chained in another dimension. Both his body and soul. The man you see before you here is nothing but a husk. There is absolutely nothing my magic can do.
Golbez didn't know what to say. He peered down the stairs toward the children, who were both now staring at them wordlessly.
And these children? His guardians. His eyes and ears of the cave. He created them from his own flesh, he's both their mother and their father, and they are an extension of his body. With his life force tethered elsewhere, I fear they haven't much longer to live, either. As you can see, their nervous systems have already started to fail. His influence over this sacred place is fading away. I can't imagine how long he's been like this. No.
Golbez growled, shaking his head.
How could something like this happen?
Fusoya stared at the ground.
If Bahamut could be captured from right under our noses, then the rest of the Eidolons could have been captured as well.
Golbez finished, and he nodded.
We need to hurry to the Crystal Palace. I fear for the crystals. If that girl was the one who did this to Bahamut, then he should have been revived by now. Something more sinister than I thought is afoot. Right?
Golbez nodded.
Can you use teleport to take us back?
Fusoya's teleport magic deposited the two of them into the crystal chamber of the palace, where they were greeted by a swath of darkness. Golbez wasted no time as he rushed from crystal to crystal, pressing his palms to each one, only to be greeted by the chill of lifeless glass. Fusoya did the same on the other side of the chamber, cursing louder under his breath with each subsequent inspection.
The crystals. The light has left all of them.
Golbez sighed, and Fusoya pressed his lips together as he slowly backed away from the last crystal, meeting up with Golbez in the middle of the room.
We were too late.
A glimmer of light, similar to what had emitted from their teleport spell when they made their arrival, burst to life before them. Stepping out of the swirl of dying white and blue sparks was the mysterious girl from the meteor, her eyes flashing as she took in Golbez and Fusoya's disconsolate forms.
You.
Golbez snarled, immediately withdrawing his sword and pressing the curved point of his blade against her throat. She blinked at him dimly as if to say,
"Now what?"
and not bothering to move out of the way.
"You're still alive."
Fusoya gasped, and the girl gave a half shrug, tossing her hair over her shoulder as she reached up and pushed Golbez's blade away with her bare hand with a startling amount of strength that made his muscles throb in protest. He watched as she nonchalantly lowered her hand, which was now glistening with blood from where she had carelessly handled the blade. She let the ruby droplets fall to the crystal tiles on the floor, drip, drip, drip.
"You have my gratitude for leading me here," she cooed.
Golbez stared at his feet, he could see his legs were trembling.
"What? No. No. You were following us this entire time?"
Fusoya hissed, and she chose to ignore the question, turning instead to walk up to one of the crystals and inspecting it before nodding to herself.
"Now we have everything we need."
Fusoya marched up to her, grabbing her wrist and forcing her to spin around and face them.
"I wouldn't be so sure about that. We still need to settle a few things with you."
Golbez snapped, stepping forward and grabbing her by the nape of her neck as he pressed his sword into her chest. He leaned in close, growling into her ear.
"Tell us who you are, and what business you have with the crystals."
The mysterious girl rolled her eyes to look up at him, licking her lips as a giggle escaped.
"I believe that even someone like you, who has more muscles than brains, knows better than to think I'll answer a question like that. Why don't you take it up with my friend Leviathan, instead? You need to answer for what you did to poor Ashura, after all."
Her body once again took on the familiar yellow light and Golbez and Fusoya were tossed away from her, both dropping to the floor as she raised her hand and became surrounded by gold and jade crystal spheres. Fusoya groaned as he dragged himself up from the floor with his staff, bowing his head as a powerful gale of rain-splattered wind rushed through the crystal chamber.
"Golbez, Leviathan is one of the most powerful Eidolons, second only to Bahamut." "Right, so what's the plan?"
Golbez coughed up a mouthful of water that had assaulted his mouth as he spoke, gagging on the briny taste that made his tongue turn to sandpaper. Lifting his head from the floor, he could see a serpentine shadow emerging from the light of the crystalline spheres, rising waves of water crashing into the crystal daisies in front of them. If this kept up, they would be flooded out of the palace before they could even raise their weapons. The mysterious girl smiled serenely, rising into the air as a torrent of water brushed over the hem of her gown.
He's the Lord of the Seas, which means he's weak to the thunder element. That's our only chance.
Leviathan's earth-shaking roar announced his arrival. Another tidal wave preceded him, rising high to the chamber ceiling and crashing into Golbez and Fusoya, knocking them both back to the floor and sending them flying into the tightly sealed ivory French doors that led to the throne room. The Lord of the Seas emerged from the sea spray, a periwinkle and pearl-scaled sea snake whose red-tipped dragon's snout brushed the chamber ceiling as he let out another warning howl, his slender jaw lined with rows of triangle-shaped silver teeth. His wiry whiskers fluttered as his mouth snapped shut, transparent red and violet fins fluttering on the rear of his maw as he curled into a spiral and launched himself into wall behind Fusoya and Golbez, unleashing a storm of crystal and stone from above.
Protect!
Fusoya cried, bobbing up from the pool of water just in time to erect a golden shield over his and Golbez's heads, the rebel bouncing off with a clang and splashing into the water. Golbez surfaced, spitting out a stream of water and grinding the stinging sensation out of his eyes as he gasped for breath, his hair and cape swaying behind him. I'm never going to get a damn spell out if this water keeps dragging me under. He signaled to Fusoya that he was climbing to higher ground, turning and swimming to the nearest crystal dais to his left. He hauled himself up the stairs, which were already half covered in water, and sheathed his sword, pressing his palms together as he began to chant under his breath. Leviathan twirled around in the water, his jaw snapping hungrily as he locked his milky eyes on Golbez and made his approach, another tidal wave gathering behind him. Taking advantage of the distraction and the receding water that was being drawn into Leviathan's next assault, Fusoya scrambled to the corner nearest to him on the right, pressing his back to the wall and pointing his staff toward Leviathan's retreating form.
Thundaga!
A vein of blinding white light erupted from above, smashing into Leviathan and igniting his form in a storm of sparks and swirling smoke. He began to seize violently, his teeth gnashing in protest only inches away from Golbez. Golbez narrowed his eyes, ignoring the searing hot froth sputtering from Leviathan's maw that was hitting him in the face.
Thundaga!
Golbez's spell struck both Leviathan and the mysterious girl, who wasn't anticipating being targeted with much bigger fish for her adversaries to fry, literally. She fell from the sky with a shriek, plummeting into the choppy, rising water with a heavy splash, while Leviathan collapsed into the crystal dais Golbez had been commanding, crushing it to dust under his weight as the light at last faded from his eyes. Golbez leapt from the crumbling dais, using Leviathan's head as a launch pad to propel himself to the rear of the chamber. Withdrawing his ebony blade in midair, he plunged his sword into the water as he fell, and could feel the warm, sickening suction of his weapon connecting with his target. A geyser of red bubbled to the surface, and as the storm water finally began to subside with Leviathan's defeat, the mysterious girl's corpse came into view, her eyes once again frozen open in disbelieving shock. Golbez's black steel blade plunged cleanly through her stomach. The front of her white dress had become dyed a pale red, his sword a makeshift pistol of the morbid bloom unfurling from her lethal wound. Fusoya half waited, half ran to them, his soaking robes slowing him considerably even as the water drained away. Leviathan's massive form faded into shadow, the crystal chamber once again plunging into darkness. Golbez grimaced as he withdrew his blade, hurriedly wiping the blood away with his cloak before sheathing it. The mysterious girl continued to stare up at him blankly, and Fusoya's shadow fell over the two of them as he finally caught up. He didn't bother checking her pulse, she was clearly dead.
Is this girl immortal?
Golbez finally asked, his voice cracking with strain. He couldn't tear away his gaze, there was something terrifying and beautiful about how quickly he had taken her this time, how his finely honed instincts had slowly awoken along with him and had known exactly where to guide his blade. Those had not been gifted by Zemus, they were all his own, part of what had made him the perfect specimen for enacting Zemu's terror. Fusoya watched Golbez warily, purposely taking a step forward to put himself between his nephew and the girl. His line of sight broken, Golbez blinked, shrinking back slightly as Fusoya pursed his lips, his watery blue eyes creased.
I cannot say, but there is one thing of which I am certain, now. The blue planet's crystals are in peril.
Golbez looked away, his fingers clenching into a fist. That had been the absolute last thing he had ever wanted Fusoya to be sure about. Cecil. Fusoya sighed, taking a long look around the darkened crystal chamber and shaking his head.
I fear we have no other choice. I will call for the lunar whale. What?
Golbez frowned.
Wait. That's my father's ship, right? I thought it was buried on the blue planet. We must attune our crystals with the lunar whale's flight crystal,
Fusoya said softly.
They may no longer have light, but I think there is another way. How? By the power of our prayers.
My prayers. Golbez could feel his knees start to shake. My prayers will do you no good. The crystals refuse to resonate with the darkness in my heart. Our final confrontation with Zemus proved that much. He recalled how 17 years prior Fusoya had handed him the ninth crystal, the only crystal the Lunarians had been able to save from their destroyed planet, ordering him to unleash the light that would force Zemus to reveal his true form. But when Golbez had held the crystal aloft, praying with all the strength he had left, nothing had happened. The crystal had remained dead, and Zemus had taunted him, explaining that the crystal would shed no light for someone who had treaded the path of darkness. The crystal had only responded to one person, that nightmarish night, the Holy Paladin, an heir to their father's will, Cecil Harvey.
Golbez!
Fusoya barked, and Golbez opened his eyes. He hadn't realized he had let himself drown in his own thoughts. His uncle was glaring up at him, flecks of crimson pulsing in his stare.
The crystals put their trust in you when they woke you from stasis. You have to do this with me. This ship was your father's legacy, and by rights, it's yours now. I can't do it alone.
Golbez nodded, pressing his palms together. I'm terrified I won't have enough power to save us. But what other choice do I have?
Yes, Fusoya. Follow my lead,
Fusoya said, this time in a much gentler tone. He tugged Golbez to the center of the chamber, sinking to his knees and bowing his head. Golbez kneeled alongside him, bowing his head too and glancing at Fusoya out of the corner of his eye. Fusoya met his gaze, nodding.
That's good. Now, clear your mind, and let your heart become vulnerable and unguarded. Say whatever first comes to mind. You can speak aloud, or meditate. What's important is that you are resolute, no matter what, always seek the light. Gee, got it?
Golbez swallowed, closing his eyes. His palms slick with sweat, he threaded his fingers together to keep his hands from slipping, touching his chin to his chest. He could feel his heart thrashing uncontrollably, a trail of perspiration running down the back of his ear to the curve of his neck. Crystals of the moon. Please help us find my father's ship. We no longer have the luxury of time. Golbez shifted his weight, trying not to focus on the sharp pain the glass floor imparted on his bare knees. Fusoya was eerily silent beside him, but he did not dare open his eyes, fearing his thin thread of concentration would be promptly snipped. He swallowed again, his tongue thick and heavy in his mouth as he pushed back the first tinges of acid that had risen from his stomach. This is hopeless. How can a child of shadow possibly call upon the grace of the crystals? He could feel a sob rising in his throat. He clenched his jaw, squeezing his fingers so tightly that his nails dug into his knuckles. The only light I've ever believed in was his. I would follow him to the depths of the hell if it meant reveling in that holy radiance one last time. Cecil, the eternal light to my perpetual darkness. It's been you I've been seeking, ever since that damnable day I abandoned you in Baron, the day I fully gave my heart to Zemus. A loud crash rang out, causing both men to drop their hands and look over their shoulders. The crystal in the dais behind them had shattered into hundreds of tiny pieces, glittering rain sprinkling over their stunned forms. Golbez jumped to his feet, racing to the dais and letting out an agitated wail as he scooped a small pile of crystal dust into his shaking hands. No. No. Please tell me it wasn't my tainted prayers that did this?
What happened?
Fusoya gasped. Crystal shards crunched into the floor, a bone-chilling screech tearing through the chamber as a girl identical to the corpse at the foot of the dais appeared, wordlessly shuffling through the remains of the crystal as she kneeled next to her slain twin. She pressed her cheek against her hand, staring down at the body confusedly.
There's more than one of her.
Golbez cried, letting the crystal dust fall from his fingers. The mysterious girl glared up at him, and then quickly whipped around to face Fusoya, who had approached her from behind with his staff raised. She smirked, scooping the dead girl into her arms as if she were weightless and leaping high into the air out of their reach, a pair of translucent angel wings affixed to her shoulders.
I need none of this any longer. Neither the crystals.
She glared at the shattered crystal remains, letting out a short hiss when her eyes fell over Golbez.
Nor you. What?
Fusoya glowered.
Just how many of you are there? Irrelevant,
she snapped, disappearing in a portal of light.
She's gone,
Fusoya cried, cursing as he slammed his staff into the floor.
But what did she mean by?
He trailed off, his eyes clenching shut as if he were overtaken by a sudden spate of pain. His hand flew to his chest, clenching his robes as he gritted his teeth.
Oh no! That girl! She's after our comrades in stasis. What?
Golbez flew down the steps of the dais, pulling Fusoya against him.
Are you okay? What's happening? I'll be fine.
Fusoya shook his head, taking a deep breath but allowing himself to fall against Golbez's shoulder.
But I am attuned to the lunar core where we sleep. She is trying to tear the dimensional walls apart as we speak. If we don't stop her, she'll kill every last one of them. She knows that as long as even one Lunarian stands, it will be a fight for her to obtain the crystals.
A delicate cracking sound caught both their attentions. To their right, a crystal had begun to shake violently, hairline fractures blooming over the surface. Fusoya winced, shaking his head.
And the crystals in turn, help protect the Lunarians. If they all shatter, there will be nothing you or I can do to keep her out of the lunar core. We have to stop her before the last crystal.
At that moment, the next crystal shattered without warning, another spray of crystal debris pouring over them. Fusoya doubled over, another cry ripping from his throat as his staff clattered to the floor. Golbez shook his head, grabbing hold of Fusoya's staff and shoving it back in the old man's hands.
Then we have to get to the moon's core now.
Golbez cried.
Do you have enough strength to use teleport one last time? I'll get us as far as I can,
Fusoya groaned, trying to stand under his own power once again by using his staff as support.
No matter what, don't let go of me. If we get separated, there will be no time to seek each other out. Right.
Golbez nodded, taking hold of Fusoya's arm. He closed his eyes, preparing for the stomach-turning journey that would hurtle them through time and space. Just before the floor fell out from beneath his feet, he heard the distant jingle of another crystal meeting its end. 5 left. Golbez felt himself crash into something cold and hard, the hilt of his sword digging painfully into his back as he bounced into what he could only assume was a cavern floor. Slowly opening his eyes, he found himself in the tunnel of the lunar subterrane that was just outside the entrance to the lunar core. Glancing down at his legs to check for injuries, he found that he had been dropped into the path of footprints Cecil and the others had left behind, now smeared into a pile of dust that was the shape of his backside and legs. Fusoya was rising a few feet away from him, shaking his head as he turned to Golbez and clutched his staff.
I could feel it as we fell. Another crystal has shattered. I got distracted, and we landed here.
4 left.
It's okay,
Golbez said quickly, scrambling to his feet.
The lunar core is just a short walk away, now. You need to recover your mana, cast Osmos on me, and drain mine so you can replenish yourself.
Fusoya raised a forked eyebrow, and gave Golbez a swift knock on the shoulder with his staff.
Ow!
Golbez hissed.
What was that for? I'm not as weak as I look, young man, I'll be fine. I'm not going to become a parasite that feeds off his nephew. Let's just hurry. Young man.
Golbez muttered.
Compared to you, maybe.
They rushed into the lunar core, just the nearby presence of the sleeping Lunarians only a few floors below filled Golbez with a mystifying adrenaline that made him feel as if he could directly tap into the essence of the red moon itself. He realized it had been similar to the feeling that had driven him to the surface of the moon in the first place, when the crystals had been calling to him, transmitting their fears into his very heart with each pulse of the ruby light. This is truly where I belong, no matter what I may wish for in the shadows of my heart. If the lunar whale appears, Fusoya will need to go alone. I can't ever set foot on the blue planet again. Just as they reached the rune that would take them to the next layer of the core, Golbez and Fusoya both paused, twin pangs discharging in their chests as the sound of glass shattering vibrated in the distance.
Another crystal.
They murmured in unison, their eyes meeting before moving to the rune and transporting to the next floor. 3 left. On each subsequent layer, an additional crystal shattered. Despite falling deeper into the moon's core, the sounds of the crystal's annihilation got louder and more distinct. Golbez could even swear he heard the crystals screaming in agony. By the time they reached the final layer that would grant them access to the sleeping Lunarians, the second-to-last crystal had shattered, leaving them with just one more and no sign of the mysterious girl anywhere. Fusoya had quickly teleported into the first sleeping dimension to make a sweep for the mysterious girl, but it did not appear that she had been able to force herself inside. As he made his return, he stumbled through the light of the portal he had opened, his eyes wild as he shook his head.
No sign of her. Perhaps it's for the best that she did not make it this far yet,
Golbez frowned.
Maybe we have reached them in time. We still have one crystal left. If we pray, it may be able to hold her back a little while longer.
Fusoya nodded.
Good idea.
The light had nearly all but faded in the tiny shrine atop Mount Ordeals. The northern mirrored wall had been shattered into thousands of pieces, some the size of tiny daggers, and some ground into dust, all strewn along the footprint and blood-ridden floors. The three opposite walls of the shrine, embedded in budding crystals that pulsed in rainbow light with the rhythm of a beating heart, had dulled to a murky gray, reflecting only the swirling oblivion that lay beyond the shattered mirror. A quiet voice whispered from within the darkness, even though there were no longer any living souls to bear its lament, the dragoon had fled, and the white mage and her companions had followed. For the briefest of moments, the shrine became alight in brilliance once more, the shattered mirror shards sparkling like diamonds in a goddess crown.
I shall pray as well, my sons.
My Cydia. Porum peered outside the window facing south, raising her hand to shield her eyes from the glaring sun. At first she thought the elder had been watching the twin moons, the new arrival seemingly larger than it was yesterday, but his chin was tilted down, his palms pressed against the glass.
Elder. The dragon. It's crying,
the elder rasped, his voice weakened. Porum frowned, redirecting her gaze toward the shoreline instead. Even from their distance high in the tower, she could see the white waves of the ocean churning with agitation, swirls of water crashing into each other in the early beginnings of a vortex.
What?
Porum gasped, smashing her face against the glass. The vortex gradually began to widen, and there was a tremendous crash that ripped through the sky. It sounded like thunder, but the skies were still crystal clear. A massive black and glowing red curved vessel emerged from the water, steadily rising in the air and casting a dark, twisting shadow upon the churning seas. Golbez and Fusoya felt the holy light singe their eyelids before the rest of it washed over them, flushing their faces with fever. Golbez felt as if a pair of strangely familiar, protective arms had wrapped around him from behind, a head pressing against his as a hand rested upon his heart.
Father.
Golbez murmured, unfolding his hands and pressing his fingers over the spot on his chest where he had felt the concentration of warmth, his eyes still closed.
Is that Kluya?
Fusoya gasped, and Golbez felt the sting of tears threatening to spill. His eyes snapped open, and the light faded away. He was still in the final layer of the lunar core, kneeling next to Fusoya. Fusoya's eyes opened as well, and he turned to Golbez. He could see a solitary tear running down his uncle's craggy cheek.
My father. Why has he?
Golbez began, but gasped for air as his stomach suddenly contracted, feeling like someone had just planted a boot in his gut. Fusoya's eyes widened and he stumbled to his feet wordlessly, spinning to face the rear of the chamber. Golbez cursed under his breath, grinding his teeth as he pulled himself up as well, still clenching his stomach as the now familiar ringing noise exploded in his ears. It sounded as if someone had shoved an entire cabinet of china down a flight of stairs.
The last crystal has shattered.
Golbez groaned, and Fusoya lowered his head.
No. Kluya. What is the meaning of all this?
The floor beneath their feet began to tremble viciously, and Golbez had to clutch onto a pillar to keep from falling over.
What's going on? Is she here?
A thunderclap rang out from above, a deafening crash of flying crystal from the rear of the chamber sending debris straight for Golbez and Fusoya. Golbez dove forward just in time, shoving Fusoya to the ground before a particularly sharp slab of crystal tile ran him through like a gutted fish. Erupting from the crash site was a twisting furnace of black flame, quickly spiraling to 3 times their combined heights and shooting through the ceiling to the next level of the lunar core. Fusoya lifted his head, his eyes narrowed as Golbez rolled off of him.
This is much worse than our new friend, there's no doubt about it. The crystals are gone. Which means there's nothing left to hold him back any longer.
Golbez turned, raising his eyebrows. There was only one hymn that the crystals had ever played a role in sealing away in the Red Moon's history.
Zemus? No, Zemus is dead, but... Zeramus.
Fusoya nodded.
If we fail, both we Lunarians and the Blue Planet will have no hope left. You understand what needs to be done, right, Golbez?
Of course. Golbez frowned.
But this time, I intend to finish what I started.
Besides, Cecil isn't here to save you, this time. They both climbed to their feet, watching silently as the fiery cyclone began to stretch and warp, a pair of bloody red tentacle-ridden claws stepping out before the rest of him followed. Zeramus's ivory exoskeleton housed a macabre collection of twisted masses of throbbing, ropey, cobalt blue muscles that were mostly left exposed, save for bone wrapped around his head, arms, torso, and rib cage. His spine was bent sharply, a steep curve between his rib cage and the arch of an oversized hump and brain cavity, melded together. 2 arms and blackened, half-rotted fins had sprouted just above his jumbled rib cage, his arms fitted with protruding spikes and tapered claws. Haphazardly growing out of pockets of hollowed-out bone throughout his body were large, watery blue orbs. It was hard to tell if they were eyes, leaking sores, or served some other terrifying purpose.
Ugly as ever, I see,
Golbez mused aloud.
But I seem to remember you looking just a little more full of life last time. Guess the past 17 years have not been treating you well, eh?
Zeramus let out a gurgling hiss in reply, swinging one of his massive claws as he lumbered forward. Both Fusoya and Golbez leapt back, nodding to each other.
Prepare to give all your power to me, dear, Golbez, we'll twin cast. Right.
The 2 men dashed off in opposite directions to buy time. Zeramus would get confused about whom to follow first. He had seemingly traded in any sentient thought for those piles of tentacles and muscles. Golbez slid behind a crystal pillar, closing his eyes and folding his hands beneath his chest. He had to trust that Fusoya would come through with healing magic after the fact if something were to happen to him. He had to power through the complex set of incantations for Meteor with no interruptions if their twin cast was to be successful, and stay in perfect sync with Fusoya at the same time. On the other side of the chamber, Fusoya hid behind a pillar of his own, sliding his eyes shut and picturing Golbez in his mind's eye. He could see his nephew across the chamber, bowing his head and starting his portion of the spell. Fusoya began to chant as well, his pale skin taking on an orange hue as the magic started to ignite every nerve ending in his body, his mana churning into overdrive. Kluya, if you're still here, I need any strength you are willing to lend me. I'll do whatever it takes to save your son. And our people. Zeramus snarled as he turned left, finally deciding that it was Golbez he wanted to take out first. His massive frame and clumsy footsteps made the entire lunar core shake, with Golbez stumbling to his knees. Ignoring the rising panic that was clutching his chest, Golbez kept his eyes glued shut, concentrating on the picture he was painting in his mind, the heavens torn asunder, thousands of stars bending to his will, the ultimate destructive power of the cosmos his to manipulate with blood-stained hands. Zeramus tore the column Golbez had been hiding behind out of the floor, snapping it in half with an angry roar and tossing the pieces to the floor, which subsequently shattered and turned into a gaping, starlit chasm. Golbez inwardly clenched as he felt Zeramus' claw wrap around him, plucking him from the ground and squeezing so hard that he swore he heard a couple ribs snap. The pain was breathtaking, and he could see spots of black bleeding into his mind's creation, like someone had carelessly spilled ink over parchment. No. No. Just a little more time. Zeramus lifted Golbez into the air, a twist of ropey tentacles emerging from one of the blue orbs on his chest and wrapping around Golbez's bare legs. He could feel his insides being torn apart as the tentacles and the claws played tug-of-war, stars bursting behind his eyelids as another tentacle slid around his abdomen and forced him to expel all of the oxygen from his body. Alarm bells exploded in his head, a tiny voice gasping as the air rushed out of his lungs.
Brother? Where are you? It's so dark. Cecil.
An explosion of crystal blue filled Golbez's vision, and the first meteor plummeted from the sky, smashing into Zeramus's back and forcing him to drop the sorcerer. Golbez fell through the chasm, his fingers clutching the jagged ledge as fiery wreckage from the first meteor strike rained upon him from above. Hundreds more meteors followed in its wake, the chamber igniting with starlight and flame as Zeramus was beaten backwards away from the chasm, stumbling on his bony haunches and falling on his back with an earth-shaking crash.
Damn!
Golbez cried, his fingers slipping from the impact. He was left with just his right hand grasping the ledge, his fingers slowly sliding down the remainder of the glass tile. He tried to swing his arm back up, but the stabbing in his sides had become too much. He could feel shards of bone piercing his lungs with every little movement, every attempt to breathe.
Float.
A pair of angel wings fluttered over Golbez's shoulder blades, gently lifting him from the chasm and guiding him away from Zeramis and the meteor shower. Golbez let his arms drop to his sides in relief, tears stinging the corners of his eyes as the blood rushed back through his limbs, bringing with it a new wave of agony. Fusoya appeared from behind a pillar, his eyes flashing as he raised his staff and cast another spell.
Kirija.
Golbez slumped to his knees in midair as the soothing rainbow light embraced his form, gold sparks exploding in his vision. He could feel his body mending itself from the inside out, deft fingers of light weaving his torn muscles back together and fusing bone back to bone.
We did it.
Fusoya muttered, promptly collapsing to the floor.
Fusoya.
Golbez gasped, his eyes snapping open.
You've overworked yourself.
He crawled to his uncle's side, pressing his fingers to his wrist. A faint pulse fluttered. He was still alive, but his mana was shot. Golbez's float spell faded away, and he gently fell to the floor, pulling Fusoya against him. I can try to take him to the stasis pods. He'll be able to rest there. If the mysterious girl comes, I'll take her on myself.
I cannot be destroyed.
A gurgling, growling voice rose from the battered mountain of putrid meat and bone that Zeramis had become, the last of the meteors having made their landing. Golbez lowered his head as a rush of lightning-laced gales cut through them like razor blades, throwing his body over Fusoya's and biting his tongue with each fresh slice he felt opening on his newly healed skin. Zeramis laughed as the winds whipped into a frenzy, lightning strikes randomly crashing into the floor all around them. Golbez figured it was only a matter of time before they were hit, and he wasn't too confident about his ability to survive an impromptu electrocution.
Gahaha. Evil is evolution at its purest. Fusoya, we have to get out of here,
Golbez hissed over the whirlwind.
Tell me the spell to get to the pods.
Fusoya slowly opened his eyes, peering up at his nephew's worried grimace.
It is time, Golbez.
Golbez blinked.
Time for what? We're in the middle of something. The battle isn't over quite yet.
Fusoya's eyes filled with crimson light. He suddenly reached up, grasping Golbez's face in both of his hands with a surprising burst of strength, his lips curling in a sad smile.
To the blue planet. Fusoya.
Golbez cried, trying to yank away.
No.
But it was too late. Golbez was swallowed by a pillar of light, Fusoya's now empty hands dropping to the floor as Zeramis's roars of laughter rolled over his still form, drawing him into his storm like the tides of the blue planet. The lunar core, 17 years prior.
We must go now, and sleep. We will pray for the peace of your planet.
Fusoya turned to Golbez.
Come, let us go. I'll be your guide.
Golbez turned away from Cecil, and nodded to Fusoya.
Yes.
They began to walk away, Golbez lowering his head. Can I really do this? Banish myself into sleep for God knows how long? It's possible I may not see him again. He could be even long dead before I awaken. But the thought of going back to that planet, where I've done so much irreparable harm, where I've destroyed so many precious lives. No, I deserve this. I deserve to suffer, to repent, to be branded a coward the rest of my days. Rosa leaned in, whispering, but her voice still carried in the empty crystalline hall as if she had shouted.
Cecil.
Rosa, forgive me for ensnaring you in my traps, just to get to Cecil. I pray that you too can move past everything that has been done, and are able to find the true happiness you both deserve. Cain frowned.
Is this all right, letting him go?
Cain, I destroyed your friendship with Cecil, and drove a wedge between you from which you may never be able to fully recover. I'll never quite understand why it was I chose you, but I have a theory that my own innate jealousy played a role, even if I didn't realize it at the time.
Your brothers.
Rydia hissed. Rydia, if I hadn't placed Cagnazo on Baron's throne in place of their rightful king, Cecil and Cain would have never been sent to Mist, they would have never murdered your mother, or destroyed your village. An entire legacy of summoners, snuffed out by my guiding hand. Without looking back, Golbez raised a single hand in the air.
Farewell.
Fusoya opened a transparent portal, and stepped inside, disappearing from sight. Golbez paused for a moment, the reality of his decision sinking deep into his core, turning his boots to lead. But even so, he started to walk forward again. I can never go back. Not after all I've done.
Cecil.
Edge touched his shoulder.
Make sure this is what you want. Just really be sure.
Edge, I left Ruby Kant to his own devices and allowed him to murder and desecrate your parents. It was never any concern of mine what was done to obtain access to the Tower of Babel, but now my lack of interest will haunt me for the rest of my days. I can't say I would have done anything less horrific. It's the same sin either way. Golbez reached the portal, taking a deep breath as he prepared to leap inside. He heard the sound of hurried footsteps from behind, and Cecil's exhausted voice calling out.
Farewell, my brother.
Golbez looked over his shoulder to Cecil. His little brother was only a few feet away, his hand raised in the air in a half-wave. His crystalline eyes were watering, and his lower lip was stained red from where he had been clearly gnawing on it. Golbez wished, more than anything, he could show his true face to Cecil, but a paralyzing fear deep within stopped him from reaching up to remove his helmet. Even with as much retribution as he was prepared to face for his sins, the thought of his little brother being able to associate his true guise with the terror he had inflicted upon him and his planet was still too much, too soon. He realized there was only one gift he could give to Cecil before he departed, a small piece of the puzzle that would unlock his past, should he ever wish to pursue it. And if he didn't, well, Golbez thought that was a fine choice as well. Cecil had been raised in an entirely different world than he, after all, maybe he didn't want to unearth the ghosts of a life that had been stolen away from him. Golbez swallowed the lump that had formed in his throat.
Her name was Cecilia. Our mother. And you have her eyes.
Before Cecil could reply, and before he could convince himself to turn around and run back to the people whose lives he had destroyed, Golbez stepped into the portal, letting the darkness and starlight devour his form. Thank you, brother. The Giant of Babel, 17 years prior.
Awaken.
A gentle spark of light burst to life from midair and encircled Golbez, climbing the length of his body until it reached his chest, and plunging through the armored breastplate that protected his heart. Golbez let out a wail and fell to his knees, clutching his head and seizing violently. He had lost all control of his body, and felt as if his bones were about to leap out of his skin.
Oh.
Fusoya climbed to his feet, but Cecil was stunned by Golbez's screams and could not bring himself to do the same. Golbez dropped his hands from his head to the floor, gasping for breath as he attempted to push himself up onto his hands and knees. This armor. It was so heavy. Excruciatingly so. Why in God's name was he wearing it? Why, until just a moment ago, had he wanted to reach out and snap Cecil's neck in his bare hands? The last thing he remembered was being in bed. No, falling to the floor. In terrible, wretched pain. Cerulean eyes flashing above him, bathed in moonlight.
Why? Why was I so consumed by hate?
He inhaled and exhaled unsteadily, feeling as if he had just been drowned and resuscitated in quick succession. Fusoya approached him, picking up his discarded staff and tapping it on the floor next to Golbez's bowed head.
You've regained your sense then. Do you remember your father's name?
Golbez looked up at Fusoya, a man he was pretty sure he had never seen before, yet he recognized like an old friend. Surely he was one, if he was asking about his father? Golbez shakily rose to one knee, his eyes desperately seeking Cecil's, even though he couldn't quite understand why. Cecil met his gaze, glaring at him hatefully, and Golbez noticed his fingers were readied on his sword.
My father. His name was Kluya.
The crystal chamber at Jot's castle, 17 years prior.
Ha 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 ha.
Golbez burst out laughing.
That is all the power you possess? A pity.
He waved his hand again, casting hold on Cecil and his pathetic adversaries, including that traitorous wench, Cane Highwind. The four of them slumped to the floor before him, golden beams of light wrapped around them like rope as they screamed in their throats. Their jaws had been frozen shut, denying them any release.
Your eyes should still be free,
Golbez sneered.
Open them, and gaze upon true terror. Come forth, my creature of shadow.
A thick black and navy fog began to rise out of mirrored floors beneath them, slowly spiraling its way up in the air to form the shape of a wiry creature. Long, tapered claws emerged from the fog, followed by a snout filled with glistening yellow teeth dripping with a neon green poison. At last, the rest of the head and scaly body formed, a shadow dragon, live in the flesh, one of the most terrifying monsters in existence. Golbez had been looking for an ideal opportunity to show off his new pet. The dragon let out a roar, fixing its ruby eyes first on Cane, and with a snap of its jaws, spat poison in his face. Cane immediately passed out, Golbez's spell of paralysis broken as the dragoon's body smacked the glass floor of the crystal chamber. The shadow dragon made its way down the line of prey, knocking out Yang, and then Rosa. After what felt like an eternity, it focused its gaze on Cecil, and Cecil closed his eyes, the fear clutching him so tightly now that he thought he might pass out on his own before the poison even hit. Golbez cocked his head to the side, a smile on his lips. His gaze locked once more on that piercing, cerulean blue. This time, he felt none of the confusion and pain from before. Whatever momentary madness had seized him in the Tower of Zot was now past. He was filled with nothing but glee. This little game of cat and mouse would come to an end, for good.
Farewell, Cecil.
A loud, agonized cry reverberated through the crystal chamber, a spell of cold air filling the room and leaving behind dancing white particles that sparkled vexatiously in the air. Golbez whirled around in the direction of the wind, a gasp escaping his lips. A translucent white, spiked tail swatted back and forth angrily, attached to a dragon with pearl scales, a long, slender neck, and eyes the color of the blue crystals of the overworld. Swirling around it, trailing in and out of its nostrils as it breathed, was the same chilling mist that had suddenly filled the crystal chamber. The dragon let out another cry and thrashed its head, the mist pouring out of its mouth and embracing the shadow dragon. The shadow dragon let out a shriek that was so loud, the mirrored walls began to shatter, shooting shards of glass everywhere. The mist, upon making contact with the shadow dragon's scales, began to smoke and burn with holy blue light. The fire completely enveloped the shadow dragon and it fell, screaming, dissolving back into black, repugnant fog that sank to the floor. Golbez was dumbstruck, his eyes never left the swirling black mist at his feet as he muttered to himself.
An Eidolon. My shadow dragon, slain by mere mist.
There was the sound of a cracking whip, and Cecil, who had been spared just in time from the shadow dragon's poison, suddenly fell forward, released from his paralysis. A gentle female voice called out, sending a shiver of fear down Golbez's spine. Where had he heard that voice before?
It's all right. You can move now.
A flash of emerald green leapt from behind Cecil and landed on the back of the white dragon. The Tower of Zot, 17 years prior.
Tella.
Cecil cried.
Stop. You've won.
The elderly man wheezed for breath even as he continued chanting, leaning upon his staff as Golbez attempted to peel himself from the floor, having just been assaulted by a trio of admittedly powerful magic spells. He climbed to one knee, not able to help but giggle when he took in the look of horror on Cecil's face. It would seem that the newly minted paladin could see the writing on the wall as plainly as he. Old man Tello was on his last legs.
Ha ha ha.
Golbez laughed, punching his fist into the floor in an attempt to mask struggle he had in maintaining his balance. Let's finish this, the old bastard's ego is out of control. All I have to do is get him to finish this spell, and the effort will take him out of commission. If Firaga, Blizzaga and Thundaga are the best he can do, then this last attempt is going to feel like a tickle fight.
Feeble old man. What can you hope to do to me?
Tella stopped chanting, and the room fell eerily silent. From what felt like very far away, both Cecil and Golbez could hear a faint whistle, strangely foreign from the ticking and mechanical static that usually filled the Tower of Zot.
Meteor's time has come at last,
Tella breathed raggedly, raising his staff into the air and stretching his arms wide.
At long last, I will avenge my Anna.
Meteor? No. That can't be. That senile coot has no idea what he is talking about.
No Tella, you mustn't tea.
Cecil cried, throwing himself at Tella but being blown backwards like a child tossing away a toy. The sage had protected himself with a magic shield so that no one could interfere.
You'll be the one it destroys.
Yang pleaded, joining Cecil's attempt but also stymied by the barrier.
So be it.
Tella growled, looking over at his friends. Cecil had dragged quite the motley crew along with him for this expedition, the same high monk who had tried to get in his way in Fabul, an engineer hailing from Baron, and the ever-annoying old man whose daughter had apparently been collateral damage in Damcyan, Hoops. The glasses on Tella's face had cracked, revealing two tired, tear-rimmed, soft grey eyes. His gaze focused on Cecil's a heartbeat longer, and then he turned away toward Golbez.
Let my life fuel the spell. That ends his. No, you fool.
Sid screamed.
Stop this.
The whistling from earlier suddenly became ear-piercingly louder. The atmosphere above them darkened to a sickly black-brown, swirling into a miniature spiral galaxy. It was so large, that it made it appear as if the ceiling had been blown away above them. Golbez clenched his jaw as he stared, a funny feeling clawing at his stomach as his knees gave out, and he sank back to the floor. Impossible. How could he? Hundreds of flaming, glittering meteors began to pour from the galaxy's center, each one striking Golbez with the force of an airship, tossing and battering his body from all angles like a rag doll. At first, he was shaken numb by being rattled about inside his cage of armor, but when that started cracking and shattering, a fresh wave of searing pain and blistering burns washed over his now exposed flesh, sending him into shock. When the last meteor struck, the barren white room returned to its normal sterile atmosphere, minus the majority of the lights that had been blown to smithereens from the fallout. Golbez fell on his face to the floor, his still intact, but cracked, helmet ringing achingly against his ears. His thoughts were racing 1,000,000 miles per hour through his mind, but he could only manage to slur one stupid question.
I am. Impossible. You, how could someone like you know meteor?
Tella responded by collapsing in a heap of robes, his staff clattering across the floor and coming to a stop by Golbez's head.
Tella.
Cecil kneeled before the old man, pulling him into his arms and trying to push the fried, scraggly white hair from his face. Golbez took a deep breath, banishing the painful effort of thinking and channeling that energy into pulling himself back up to his feet instead, smashing both of his palms against his helmet to weld it back on temporarily. Crushing Tella's staff underneath his boot as if it were a piece of candy, he extended his hand and created a black teleportation portal.
Regardless. The Earth Crystal is now mine. Come, Kane.
Kane's eyes rolled into the back of his head and he promptly slumped against the glass wall behind him, his spear falling from his hands as he crashed to the floor. Golbez tilted his head, barking out a laugh. Great, just great.
So? The old man's interference severed my hold over you. No matter. Your purpose is served. Just do not think that this affront will be forgiven.
Cecil held Tella closer and pointed his blade at Golbez. Yang had his claws extended, and Sid readied his hammer. Cecil's minions had surrounded him while he had been distracted by Kane's foolishness.
You'll not escape this time, Golbez.
Cecil shouted. Golbez's gaze left Kane's crumpled form, and he turned back to Cecil, exasperated.
You try my patience.
He raised a hand, prepared to end Cecil's life with a flare spell. He wanted to see the light leave the petulant brat's eyes once and for all and savor every delicious second of it. That would just be a bonus on top of obtaining the fourth crystal. As he stared into Cecil's defiant blue eyes, silently chanting the incantation, he felt the ancient words suddenly choke up in his throat, and he faltered.
Why? Why now stay your hand?
Cecil demanded, his voice never wavering.
But? How?
Golbez shook his head, turning away. Cecil's stare had penetrated his mind's eye and muted his tongue. What did those eyes remind him of? He had such a serene, calming presence. Why had Golbez not noticed until now? Was it because he had become a paladin, or? Cecilia. Wait. Who is Cecilia? I don't know a Cecilia. This is Cecil. The enemy. The one he warned me about, the one that will destroy everything we've worked so hard to achieve. Cecil kept staring, daring Golbez with his glare to finish the spell. Golbez finally threw up his hands and rushed into the teleportation portal, before its magic failed him as well. He turned one last time to face Cecil as he disappeared into the void, his voice strained and muffled beneath his helmet.
We will finish this another time.
The Fabulian Crystal Chamber, 17 years prior. Cain twirled his lance in his fingers as he approached Cecil, raising the blade above his head and staring down at his bloodied best friend. Cecil cringed and closed his eyes, the will to fight completely leaving him. He could only pray now that this would end quickly, before anyone else got hurt on his account. Whatever he had done to Cain, he supposed he would have to answer for it in hell.
Cain, why ever do you hesitate?
A dark shadow had blocked the light shining through the open doorway to the crystal chamber. The shadow drifted forward as if floating, approaching Cecil and Cain with the demeanor of an emperor. He saw two figures, a young woman with a fountain of blonde hair pulled back into a ponytail and a little girl with frizzy green hair and a snarl set across her lips, pressed deeper back against the wall near the doorway as he passed through. He knew from the aura of despair that he could practically smell coming off the lot of them that his appearance had elicited a healthy fear from these so-called men. He could see his reflection in the mirrored walls of the crystal chamber, and couldn't help but smile at the attention he commanded just by the minimal effort of crossing a threshold. He was clad in black armor from head to toe, the only thing on his body not black being the glowing yellow orbs that were shining from inside his helmet, like dragon's eyes. Upon his helmet protruded two grotesque black horns that nearly reached the ceiling. A black leather cape dragged on the floor as he stepped forward in metal-cased, spiked boots, and yet he carried his bulk with such a grace that his footsteps made nary a sound. He approached Cain and a thoroughly defeated Dark Knight, whom he caught eyeing his onyx-lined gauntlet, the tips of which were sharpened into sharp black points. Reaching out his long, claw-like hand, he made a gesture from Cain's lance down toward the Dark Knight, and snickered.
He's right there, Cain. You must be Golbez, the usurper,
the Dark Knight hissed. The knight's voice was calm and tempered despite the rage Golbez could feel simmering at the surface of the young man's heart. He had an elegant accent clipped with an aristocratic air that made him sound far more accomplished than he probably actually was. After all, what kind of master of the Dark Blade couldn't take down a mere dragoon?
And you're Cecil, I presume,
Golbez replied.
I've been anxious to meet you, but I'm afraid our visit is going to have to be cut short.
He turned to Cain, smiling with satisfaction at Cecil's jaw hitting the floor.
Never hesitate to kill, Cain. Let me show you how it's done.
He raised his hand, which had begun to glow an ominous purple.
Cecil!
Edward cried. The cowardly slip of a prince was pressed up against the corner wall of the chamber, shaking like a leaf. Golbez felt a twitch spasm above his eye, regretting that he had let the wretch live, but fine, he would let him see his friends die, and then maybe he would go ahead and finish what he had started in Damcyan, depending on how generous he felt after he got what he came for.
I will not allow you to harm Cecil,
a Fabulian high monk demanded, cutting in front of Cecil's fallen form and raising his fists. Even though the monk was the largest man in the room, he still only came up to Golbez's chest. Golbez shook his head and laughed. This was almost too adorable.
I did not come to treat with worms,
he hissed, and thrust his palm forward. An immense wave of dark energy washed over the entire room, knocking the monk and Prince Edward to their knees. Cecil's head slammed back to the mirrored floor, his eyes clenched shut. The little girl was frozen stiff, horror in her eyes as all the men before her fell, with the exception of Cain and himself. Golbez pointed toward the glimmering crystal before them, only feet away on the dais.
Enough of this foolishness. Cain, bring me the crystal.
Of course, he could have easily gotten it himself. But he wanted to see the look in Cecil's eyes as the man who had supposedly been his best friend made the final twist of the knife that had been planted in his back. It was the little things that brought him such joy during these trite efforts.
Yes, my lord.
Cain bowed his head slightly and turned, climbing up the staircase of the dais. Cecil didn't move, a little to Golbez's disappointment.
Don't do it, Cain.
The blonde woman suddenly cried, pushing off the wall and reaching her hand out toward him. Cain paused on the last step and looked over at her, a grimace on his lips.
Rosa, leave it be.
Cecil suddenly moaned, dragging himself up from the floor. Golbez looked over his shoulder at the girl he had called Rosa, and chuckled. Perhaps I miscalculated. The boy's weakness may not have been Cain, after all. Still, the dragoon has proven useful enough. I just rather dislike wasting my time.
Oh, you care for this one, do you? Then let me take her along as well. To hold in trust until we are graced with the chance to meet again. Come, Cain.
Golbez suddenly teleported to Rosa's side, gripping her upper arm within his claw and lifting her up from the floor, pulling her close to his chest. Rosa cried out and tried to jerk away, but her efforts were meaningless. He let her squirm helplessly, tears springing from her eyes as she made a final attempt to extend her hand outward.
Cecil. Rosa.
Cecil moaned, struggling to rise onto his knees. Golbez smiled, tossing Rosa over his shoulder and opening a portal made of pulsing purple light with his free hand. Cain snatched the crystal of wind, tucking it under his arm and tilting his head toward Cecil as he left by.
It would seem your life has been spared. For now.
He turned away and leapt into the portal, Golbez and Rosa disappearing behind him. As the magic began to fade behind them, sending them plunging between dimensions, Golbez could hear Cecil's pathetic whimpers.
Cain. Wait. Erg. God damnit.
I want to see you again soon, Cecil. Promise you won't make me wait long. Village on Baron's outskirts, 37 years prior. Theodore lay on his mother's bed, or at least, what had been his mother's bed up until a few hours prior, staring at the baby boy swaddled next to him. The baby was sleeping peacefully, completely unaware that he had been brought into the world an orphan, but Theodore hadn't been able to get a moment of rest since some kind neighbors had removed Cecilia's body from their house, promising that they would be back tomorrow to help bury her in the plot next to his father in the woods to the north. It had only been a few weeks since it had come into existence, the overturned earth had not yet even settled yet, and they would now go tearing back into it in less than 12 hours. The midwife had left him tucked into his own bed, whispering that she was going to stop at home to get a few items so that she could spend the night, and asked him to leave the baby alone, whom she had finally gotten nursed and settled in for the night. But as soon as she had left, Theodore had rolled out of his bed and immediately gone to Cecilia's, crawling next to his new baby brother and trying to fall asleep to his calm, steady breathing noises he emitted from his rosebud lips. He could still smell his mother on the pillowcase, a mix of her favorite lavender perfume and stale sweat from her nightmarish labor. The midwife had immediately stripped the bed of the bloodied sheets from Cecilia's delivery, but must have forgotten about the pillows in the chaos that had followed once the baby started crying for milk. Theodore made a mental note to switch the pillow himself before the midwife got back. She would catch its scent as soon as she went to bed, and would insist on tossing it in the tub of laundry she had already gotten started in the backyard. He wasn't ready to purge every piece of evidence that just hours ago, Cecilia had been a living, breathing presence. That pillow had been the last thing she had touched, falling back against it with the baby in her arms as she breathed her final words that echoed over and over again in Theodore's ears.
Thank goodness. Mother.
Theodore whimpered, clutching the pillow tighter as he choked on his sobs. Thank goodness for what? You didn't want to leave us to be with father, right? What are the baby and I going to do without you? He doesn't even have a name. The lanterns suddenly blew out in the house, blanketing the two of them in velvet darkness. Theodore shot up in bed, his heart throbbing in his chest. A hissing sound like a snake tickled his ears, and a low voice whispered to him.
A vile thing, isn't he? That brother of yours. What?
Theodore cried, looking around. However, the house was empty. The midwife hadn't come back yet. He would have heard the key grinding in the ancient lock. The clouds outside parted, piercing moonlight from the full twin moons bathing their bed, drowning the sleeping baby that was nestled deep a collection of worn-through blankets. They had been Theodore's from when he had been born. Cecilia had grown too depressed and weak to finish any of the blankets she had started for the new arrival after his father had been brutally murdered, and now they would remain in her abandoned knitting pile, never to be touched again. The voice came again, this time even louder and closer.
He is the root of all you've suffered. Who's there?
Theodore demanded, jumping out of bed and reaching behind it to pull out his father's old staff.
If it weren't for him, your mother and father would both still be alive.
Theodore could feel his knees knocking together as the staff slipped in his sweat-streaked palm.
And no, you're wrong. And you are a vile little insect. Birthed from a womb of a dragon's corpse are you.
Theodore screamed, covering his ears and sinking to his knees. The staff clattered to the floor, rolling under the bed. Theodore could feel something cold creeping up his spine, curling around his ribcage and clutching his heart, squeezing so hard he thought it might explode inside his chest.
Stop. Stop talking to me. It's not my brother's fault.
Another twisting pain, Theodore gagged on his sobs as he doubled over, his fingernails tearing frustratingly at his scalp. My blood. It feels like ice water. Roaring through my ears. Like I'm being frozen from the inside. The voice let out a peal of laughter and whispered once more, a shadow veiling the moonlight.
I name you Golbez.
The baby opened his crystalline cerulean eyes, startled by the sudden darkness, and let out a pitiful wail as his elder brother collapsed on the floor.
No, you're wrong. I'm.
Golbez's eyes suddenly opened, and he winced at the bright, too white artificial lights that assaulted him from above, immediately closing them shut again in objection. More nightmares. Or rather, memories. Why after all this time? After a few moments, he summoned the strength to roll himself over, cringing since the cold, metal floor provided no comfort. His battered and bruised everything, not to mention that the sterile chill of the metal didn't exactly feel great against bare skin. Propping his head onto his arms, Golbez tried opening his eyes again, this time only being greeted by smaller, blinking lights that appeared to act as an emergency exit path on the floor. The steady hum of an air current was rushing through vents from above, and dozens of windows were positioned above glowing glass consoles, all shuttered with steel enclosures. This almost looks like the bridge of a ship.
Where am I?
Golbez asked aloud, hoping someone would actually answer him. There came no reply, however. He was on his own, as Fusoya had apparently intended. Pulling himself to his feet, he padded over to a golden crystal suspended in a column of light, pressing his hand to his mouth. A crystal. But not one I've ever seen before. I must be on the lunar whale, and that is the crystal of flight. Our prayers were answered? A glowing blue button on the console ahead got his attention. He reluctantly left the crystal's warm, but lonely light, and pressed it, figuring that nothing too terrible would happen compared to the mental hellscape he had just trudged through. The metal shutters all rolled open in response, flooding the room in resplendent moonlight reflected off a familiar blue sphere hanging in the depths of space. Golbez shook his head in disbelief, his palm slamming on the console.
No. This cannot be.
The blue sphere was joined by a silver moon that Golbez had never seen before as the ship tumbled through space. It was hurling toward the planet with unbelievable speed. Even as the lunar whale zoomed past, Golbez could see the moon never drifting far behind in the rear windows of the ship. He turned back to the console, knitting his brows in frustration as he tried to pull up a navigation system. Surely his father had something like that installed. After a few minutes of a lot of button pressing and cursing, a holograph displayed over one of the windows, transforming it into a star-punctured map. Golbez could see a glowing, dotted line running from a small sphere on the edge of the map, trailing all the way across to a slightly larger blue sphere. That had to have been the blue planet, and a blinking X was slowly making its approach, the lunar whale. On the opposite side of the planet and the lunar whale, there was another sphere. Golbez figured that was the blue planet's actual moon, the one it had had since the birth of the cosmos. He pushed another button, and the map lit up with labels under each of the figures. Golbez confirmed all of his guesses had been correct. But the moon they had just passed, and by all appearances on the map, also seemed to be on the same path as the lunar whale, contained no identifier. Golbez turned to the crystal of flight, pointing to the mystery moon.
What is this?
The crystal of flight glimmered, a robotic voice chirping from speakers tucked in the corners of the bridge.
Unidentified satellite, approximately 1,000 miles in radius. Approximate travel speed based on trajectory to blue planet, 1,500 miles per hour. Approximate age, at least 1 billion years. Life form sustained. ZZZZZ. SSSSS. Error. Sorry, I am not able to complete your query.
The speakers clicked off, and Golbez sighed, crossing his arms over his chest. He had no clue what he was supposed to do once he landed on the blue planet. Fusoya had not been kind enough to let him in on his little plan before banishing him. If the blue planet's crystals were in peril as Fusoya had suspected, where could he even start in trying to find and defend them? Did anyone on the blue planet have any clue what was transpiring? Would anyone even believe him? Or would they think he was trying to enact a repeat performance of his war crimes? And as he drifted aimlessly through space, his uncle and the Lunarians were still in unspeakable danger. Golbez closed his eyes.
Crystal of Flight, are we able to change course to the Red Moon?
The speakers came on again.
Sorry, that command has been overridden. Click.
Damnation. Fusoya's miracles are quite thorough. Golbez dismissed the map and pressed his hands to the ice-cold glass, watching as the blue planet came ever closer, his heart caught in his throat. His mind drifted back to his nightmare with Cecil in the Crystal Palace, his brother's sword buried in his chest. Cecil. End of Part 2. End of chapter.